Hey guys, how you doing? It's me, 𝗕cie 𝗂𝗧 from eToro. And this week we're going to be talking about reading. When I began investing, I actively avoided reading books, and every time a YouTuber talked about which books that they were reading, I kind of tuned it out. And what I want to say is you do not need to read books. You can learn everything you need to know about investing through watching Warren Buffett's videos at his annual general meetings, and watching videos by other YouTubers, and reading financial statements. And if you just do those things, you will learn a ton of information. However, what changed for me with reading is someone gifted me The Psychology of Money, which is a book that loads of YouTubers recommend. And actually, once you've read it, it's quite funny because a lot of YouTubers actually quote things from his book without referencing it. And yeah, someone gifted me that. My brother had already read it. He said it's a really, really good book. And then I read it and I was blown away. Tons of incredible lessons. I'm dyslexic, by the way. It takes me a long time to read, and that is why I really struggle to even pick up books, and I really struggled to finish them. And what I found was I couldn't put the book down. What was really great about the book was just how simple it was. I was able to read one whole chapter in about half an hour, and I'm a slow reader. And so over the course of 20 days, I was able to finish the book. Each chapter is really, really short, and it's just 20 short chapters. Each one is a financial lesson that is woven into a story or several examples. And so it's like learning while reading a story. It's possibly one of the best ways to learn. And what I found was there was far more information in that book than was contained in any financial video I've watched. Which you'd kind of expect, right? Because a lot more effort's going to be going into a book that gets published and printed than what someone like me is going to put into a 10-minute YouTube video that I make over the course of a week. However, what I found from what other YouTubers are recommending quite a lot of the time is some of the other books that they recommend are quite long, quite wordy, and quite hard to get into, and don't actually contain a lot of relevant financial information for people today, around today. For example, one book that Warren Buffett recommends is The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham, and this book is huge. And if I hadn't have already read some other financial books and warmed myself up to this one took me about a year to read, because I had to go over some bits to make sure that the information really went in. There are some bits of good information in here, but the bulk of this book is more of a history book at how Warren Buffett arrived to his strategy today. Basically, you can read this whole book and not really learn much about the financial markets today. So the goal of this video is to give you 5 books that are easy to read, but are also rich in modern investing wisdom and actually teach you how to become a better investor, both from a philosophical perspective as well as a strategic perspective. By the way, guys, all the books mentioned in this video will be linked in the description. They are Amazon affiliate links. That means if you use those links, it will change nothing about the price, but it will mean I get a little bit of commission. So rather than Amazon getting all of the money, I get a tiny little bit of commission for having referenced you to this book. So please, if you do buy any of these books after this video, use those links and it will help support this channel. Now, the simplest book that I've read so far that contains the most financial information, the most useful investing book that exists, is Warren Buffett and the Interpretation of Financial Statements. This book, written by Mary Buffett and David Clark, 2 people that are very close with Buffett, they have observed everything that Warren Buffett looks for when reading a financial statement. Now, prior to reading this book, I had been reading financial statements for 10 years, and I learnt a ton from this tiny book about how to read them more efficiently. It literally does exactly what it says on the tin. You learn how to interpret the statements. What I really love is how this book broke down things like gross margin on the financial statement, how that represents a competitive advantage, but also what it talks about is actual examples of things that Warren Buffett bought and why in certain instances he doesn't look for those things, he looks for different things. So you really understand why certain things are important on particular stocks. It also shows how CEOs of bad businesses, how they hide the fact that what they have is a bad business, or how you can tell if a CEO is doing cheeky things. Ultimately, one of the big lessons that Warren Buffett seems to have found is that companies with a durable competitive advantage don't need good CEOs and don't need to do cheeky things on their financial statements in order to make their revenues look good, because the product already is so good that the business does well without needing to do cheeky things on your financial statement. For example, Coca-Cola don't need to do anything to make their margins look good because Coca-Cola makes their margins look good. However, Coca-Cola is such a good business that actually they keep very little cash and have a relatively large amount of long-term debt relative to their cash, something that is generally a bad thing for a business to do. But Coca-Cola can do it because their revenues, their income is so guaranteed. In almost all economies, people will buy Coca-Cola. This is why quite often durable competitive advantage shows up in unexpected ways. And you'll learn about this if you read Warren Buffett and the Interpretation of Financial Statements. It's the perfect book if you want to get into value investing and if you want to be reading financial statements and need to know where to look and how to interpret it. However, this will teach you the sort of fundamental aspects of interpreting a financial statement. One of the things that I think is also quite important is understanding the psychological effects of the market. For this, most people recommend Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money, and this is an incredible book and you should go read it. However, I personally preferred his sequel book, Same as Ever. I genuinely actually think that this book is a better book than The Psychology of Money, and the lessons in this book are actually more important. This book has forever changed how I think about investing. I used to think about investing as what's going to change, and now I think, when I think about investing, I go, what's going to be the same in 10 years' time? And ultimately, that's the lesson that this book is going to drill into your head, that some things never change. A great example of this lesson is right at the beginning of this book. A colleague of Warren Buffett is driving around with Buffett in his car and is currently in the middle of a recession, and they're looking out the window, seeing all the closed shop fronts, and he turns to Warren Buffett and says, "Oh, gosh, how do you invest in this economy?" Buffett quickly responds, however, he says, "Do you know what the best-selling candy bar was 40 years ago?" And the guy sat next to him goes, "No." And Buffett responds, "It was Snickers." Then he says, "Do you know what the best-selling candy bar is today?" Guy responds, "No." And again, Buffett responds, "Snickers." What Buffett is saying is no matter whether the economy is going to boom or bust, people are still going to be buying Snickers. This lesson doesn't just work for recessions. When Bill Gates was getting huge by investing in Microsoft, he turned to Warren Buffett, his friend already, and said, "Look, Buffett, you need to get invested in computers. It's going to change everything about how we live our lives." And Buffett said to Bill Gates famously, "Will it change the way that we chew gum?" Obviously, Gates said no, and Buffett said, "Well, then I'm going to keep investing in chewing gum and you can invest in computers." This is a lesson that I think a lot of people need to hear but do not want to hear. A great example today would be NVIDIA. AI is going to change everything about how we live our lives. Over the next 10 years, AI will have changed everything. However, whether NVIDIA is going to continue to grow at an annual rate of 40% per year is something that is up for debate. What we know with absolute certainty is even if NVIDIA changes everything about how we live our lives, we're probably still going to want to eat Snickers and drink Coca-Cola. Another great example he gives is Jeff Bezos and Amazon. Jeff Bezos, when he's talking about Amazon, he doesn't look for things that will change. He looks for things that will always be the same. And a great example of that, something that he invests in heavily, is making sure that all the products that people order online arrive reliably and fast, because people wanting products reliably and fast is never going to change. So you can invest huge amounts of money into that. Other great lessons from this book are how the economic cycle works and how we as humans tend to react emotionally to certain bits of information, and these have huge effects on the market. And so understanding humans' emotional responses can actually help you be a better investor, because you can understand when emotion is causing things to be overpriced or underpriced. Ultimately, what this book is trying to get you to do trying to get you to understand is if you were to live your life 1,000 times over, you don't want to be mega rich in 1% of those lives. What you want to be is to be rich enough in 999 of those lives. That said, let's move on to a slightly more challenging book, which is One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch. Peter Lynch wrote this book decades ago, apparently, and has been slowly updating it over the years because it's so popular. And what I would say about this book is it is a little bit more complicated. You can see that the writing on the pages is a little bit smaller than what you'll have in, say, Morgan Housel's Same as Ever. So it's a slightly more advanced book. I would perhaps read these two before getting into this book. And so what this book does is it combines a bit of psychology with a bit of interpretation of financial statements. So it's kind of like these two books combined. Unfortunately for me, this makes this book a little bit harder to read and a bit more easy to put down. Lessons in this book aren't written as neatly into a nice narrative and story. So that makes the lessons in this book just a little bit harder to learn. But with that said, the actual lessons themselves are hugely important and will definitely help you to find, as Peter Lynch puts it, 10 baggers. Stocks that make well over 10 times your money back. But it should also be said that Peter Lynch's strategy is to put his eggs in as many baskets as possible. And then when those stocks have produced 10 baggers, what he will do is potentially put more money into those positions, but what he won't do is reward a position for going down. This is a little bit different to my strategy. I personally prefer to not have too many stocks because I don't want to be endlessly reading and keeping up with 100 different companies. What I would prefer to do is have a small selection of stocks and write down what my expectations are and then keep regular tabs on those companies. But I definitely have learned a lot from reading Peter Lynch's book, One Up on Wall Street. It is still generally quite simple and easy to read, and the lessons in this book are really valuable. Next up, speaking of valuable lessons in books, the most valuable lesson I ever learned in any book has absolutely nothing to do with finance: black box thinking. This book contains the most valuable lesson that any investor has to learn, which is how to confront confirmation bias. Many studies have shown that we have a home country bias, we have a recency bias, so the information that we've heard the most recently, we have a bias towards that, even though that recency doesn't make it any more true. We have bias to think towards things that we've heard multiple times. A lie that's been repeated over and over again, we're more likely to believe it's true. We also have a bias towards things that we have already bought. So if you have bought into a stock, you're going to have a bias towards that stock. And the longer that you hold it for, you're probably going to have an even bigger bias towards it. But you also have a bias towards stocks that you did not buy. The brain wants to believe that it avoided risk, so it will interpret information in a way that confirms your existing bias. What's scary is when these things that we are biased against start slapping us in the face with the truth, the more intelligent you are, the more elaborate the thought structures you create to confirm your existing bias. Whereas if you are less intelligent, you are more likely to look at things objectively. Of course, intelligence is really useful in investing, but the more intelligent you get, the more likely you are to have confirmation bias. So that is why this book is so important. It also breaks down why doctors make so many mistakes over and over and over again, because they're so intelligent that they create elaborate systems to prevent learning from mistakes. It also explains how the airline industry has managed to overcome this and build one of the safest forms of travel in the world. And that is why it's called black box thinking, because it is talking about the black box in an airline that records every decision that goes on in the cockpit, so that when a mistake inevitably occurs, they can at the very least learn from it. This book starts with an incredibly tense story of a mistake that happened in an ER room to a pilot's wife, and something that should have been routine ended up killing his wife. And when he asked the doctors about it, they just said a mistake happened. When he was initially grieving, he just accepted this. But over time, he was like, well, how did a mistake just happen? And the book goes from there. It's an incredible read. And ultimately, this book has given me a ton of very, very simple ways as to how I can prevent myself from having confirmation bias. And if I think I've got something that I'm biased towards, it gives me ways to create structures, systems, so that in time I can see whether that bias is affecting me. Anyway, this is an absolutely brilliant book. I really recommend reading it. It's not an investment book, but it will teach you lots about confirmation bias. So definitely give this book a read. Next up, moving back to books about money, we have Money by Yuval Noah Harari. You probably know this author for his better known book, 𝗓𝗡ians. In this very short book, Joseph takes you through the history of money. It begins with the Romans and the Aztecs being confused by the Romans' obsession with gold. And that already to me is fascinating, this time where there were humans, advanced humans, that were confused by someone's obsession with gold. It points out that the Aztecs knew that gold was pretty and they used it in statues and stuff like that and thought it was interesting, but Romans were literally obsessed with it. Aztecs, when doing the bulk of their trading, would do it mostly in wheat and leather and stuff like that, things that had actual value. Romans were obsessed with something that had literally no practical value. And this is the beginning of money and the thing that regulates our exchanges, regulates our whole lives, being something that is of an imaginary value, not a tangible one. Basically, what I find funny about this is gold to the Aztecs and the Aztecs watching the Romans is a bit like how everyday people today see Bitcoin. This book takes you from the point at which money was invented as an idea. And the reason it took off was because it was so insanely practical. Joseph takes you through societies without money and what that would look like and how hard it would be for someone who had one valuable good to exchange it for another valuable good when those two people may not need each other's things implicitly. Suddenly you've got to get a third person with another valuable good that person actually wants, and God, what a nightmare it becomes. Pricing things without money is almost impossible. And yet money itself is valueless. One of the questions that I ask friends that I always find funny is, how much would I need to pay you for you to eat that whole bottle of ketchup? If you responded with the number £50, I'd think you were mental or lying. But if you responded £50 50 years ago, you'd be saying £500, which is probably too much. I'd be willing to bet that if I was to offer you £100, you'd at least start thinking about what it would actually be like to eat that bottle of ketchup. The amazing thing I find about money is that this money that I'm offering you is completely valueless, and it's funny that it can be traded for any number of absurd things. And what's really incredible is just seeing how it was created throughout history, and also this blurred line between money and markets. Both money and markets are built on trust. All society is built on trust, and that is hard to comprehend on its own. Look at China today. So many people are avoiding China, which has huge profits relative to the price of their companies purely because they don't trust them. And that is the value of trust. And what I find deeply, deeply exciting, and this book doesn't go into it, but we've just invented a new type of money that relies on two pieces of technology that never existed before. For the first time ever, we have money that is built on two things: computers and internet. And what you get to see is basically how different technical innovations have changed money, and then you get to imagine how cryptocurrency is going to change this story forever. Ultimately, this is just a short, simple storybook, and it's just one that's really enjoyable to read. And if you are like me and you enjoy finance and investing, I think understanding what money is, how it came to be, how markets came to be, is something really worth reading about. And if you can do that all in like a couple of months, then why not? And I definitely think understanding about money, about markets, how all of this came to be is crucially important to becoming a great investor and becoming financially free. But the thing that you really need to do if you want to be rich is